Has someone ever taken credit for your work in the family?
My mom did not invite me to a party because she missed me or because she wanted to fix anything. She invited me because she wanted an audience, and when she lifted her glass and tapped the microphone and told the room she had an announcement, I already knew the announcement had my name on it, so I stood there and breathed slowly and watched relatives lean in like they were about to see a magic trick, and I let her do it. I let her say that after a lot of prayer and thought she was revising her will and removing me from it because she needed to reward loyalty and respect, which, in her words, I had not shown, and the room made that polite noise people make when they want to look supportive, but also want to see drama. And my brother grinned the way he always does when the scoreboard tips his way, and I felt the heat rise in my neck, but I did not interrupt because I had not come to stop her speech. I had come to let her finish it. She went on about family values and sacrifice, and how some people bring chaos while others bring peace, and she looked at me on the word chaos like she was tossing a dart and waiting to hear the thud. And a couple of her friends did that soft nod people do when they want to stay close to the host, and I thought about the years of phone calls I took at midnight when she needed help with bills or paperwork or rides, and the hours I spent fixing messes that never made it into her speeches, and the way she always said she would make it right when the time came, and I kept my mouth shut because I knew tonight was not the time to argue history with a person who writes her own version of it. I will not lie and say it did not hurt, because it did, not even the money part, just the public stamp of rejection, the way she used a celebration to hold me up like a warning sign. And the way my cousin whispered to my aunt while glancing at my shoes like my entire life could be summed up by whether they were expensive enough. And for a second I felt that old familiar pull to explain myself, to justify every choice I ever made, to defend my job and my apartment and my boundaries with a neat speech that would convince the jury of relatives who treat family like a contest. And then I remembered I did not need a jury. I needed a calm hand and a spine. She ended with a line about grace and blessings and the importance of honoring the people who honor you, which landed very nicely with her friends who like phrases that sound embroidered on a pillow, and she raised her glass, and people clapped. And for a heartbeat the room took a breath that said the show was over and we could go back to the buffet, and that was when my brother slid next to me and said, in a voice low enough to hide behind the music, that I should not take it personally because you get what you give, and that I could still do better if I wanted back in. And I looked at him and thought how comfortable people get when someone else pays for their comfort and then calls it merit. And I told him I appreciated his coaching and that I would take it under advisement, which made him smirk because he thought he had gotten under my skin, and if he wanted to think that, fine. I lifted my own glass, not to toast her decision but to ask for the microphone, and I could feel a ripple go through the room because apparently a daughter is expected to swallow a public slap and then thank the person who delivered it. And when the microphone reached me, I kept my voice steady and I said that I heard every word and that I was not going to argue with my mother at her party because I still believe in basic manners even when the menu does not include them for me, and a few people chuckled and a few stiffened. And I went on and said that since my mom brought up honor and respect, I wanted to be practical and clear, so beginning tonight I would no longer be handling her paperwork, her insurance appeals, her pharmacy pickups, or any of the errands she has asked me to run, and that I would not be responding to calls that come in after bedtime telling me an emergency has popped up again, which only I can fix, and the room tilted because they were not expecting that move, not the refusal. Not the quiet resignation from a job nobody saw, but everyone benefited from, and I kept going and said that any future requests could be directed to her favorite child, the one who clearly understands honor and respect better than I do, and I nodded toward my brother without even looking at him, and someone actually clapped before they caught themselves. It was not fireworks, it was not a scream, it was not revenge that leaves a stain. It was simple and it was immediate, and it landed like a locked door that had been swinging open for years. And while a couple of relatives tried to pull me aside to say I was being dramatic and that I should not make trouble because wills can always be revisited if I behave, I thanked them for their concern and repeated that I was stepping down from unpaid duties effective now, and the venue manager, who had been hovering, asked if everything was okay, and I told her yes, because for me it was more okay than it had been in a very long time. My mom tried to take the microphone back and smooth it over with a little speech about forgiveness and how families talk things through in private, and she tried to make a joke about me being sensitive, which used to work on me. But I only smiled and said I would leave her to her celebration because it looks like she has everything she needs, and the smile fell off her face for a second because I did not give her the scene she wanted, and I did not give her tears, and I did not give her begging. And that, all by itself, felt like the first real step out of a trap I did not notice I was in until I had one foot outside of it. I thanked the venue staff for their work. I hugged the two relatives who have always been decent to me even when doing so was not fashionable. I placed my glass on the nearest table, and I picked up the small envelope I had tucked in my bag before I left home. Because while my announcement tonight was enough to make my point, it was only the appetizer, and the thing inside that envelope was the reason I had stood still through a very long toast without storming out, a reason my mother would not see coming, a reason that would not need a microphone at all, and as I walked toward her with that calm, steady step that made her narrow her eyes, I thought, go ahead and finish your victory lap, because I am about to start mine. I did not hand over the envelope during dessert because the moment was too easy and too loud, and I wanted silence to be part of the lesson. So I let the music do its job, and I let people make their little speeches about resilience and forgiveness, and how families always find their way back. And while they performed that play, I stood there and thought about how long this show had been running. Because what happened at that party did not begin that night. It began years earlier when my dad was still alive and paying bills on time and keeping a ledger for everything and reminding my mom that fairness is not a feeling you have on your good days, but a habit you practice when nobody is clapping. And after he passed, my mom learned that applause feels better than habits. And she built herself an audience by feeding my brother a steady diet of second chances dressed up like merit while telling me that being the reliable one is its own reward, which, as it turns out, means you pay and you drive. And you fix and you smile while someone else cuts the ribbon and accepts the congratulations. People love to say favoritism is a childish complaint and that grown adults should not keep score, but you learn to keep score when the rules never apply the same way twice, because my brother could vanish for months and return with a new plan that needed a bridge loan. And my mother would praise his grit and wire money from a line of credit secured against the house, while I could say I landed a contract and the response would be a critique of my tone, and it sounds petty until you look at bank statements and see what praise really costs, and you see the refinance that took place after my dad died, in which my mother signed papers swearing she was the sole owner, free to pledge whatever she wished. Even though the deed that recorded years back placed half the equity inside a trust my dad created, the kind of trust that stops being flexible the moment the man who built it is gone. And when I say I looked at bank statements, I do not mean I snooped. I mean I asked for copies the way any beneficiary is allowed to ask, and when copies did not arrive, I went to the county recorder and the online docket, and I pulled what is public, and the paper did not care about my mother's speeches. The paper only cared about signatures and dates. If you want to know when my plan truly started, it was the afternoon my mother told me that my dad would want me to be gracious while she figured things out, and I said of course, and then I called the attorney who handled my father's paperwork. Not to start a war, but to ask a simple question about duties, because people throw around the word will like it is the whole story, when in our family it was not, and the answer I got was not dramatic, it was calm and boring, and it said that the trust my father created became locked the day he died, that my mother remained a trustee with obligations, and that distributions from that trust had to be equal or justified on paper, and that any borrowing against trust assets had to be disclosed, and that a beneficiary has the right to request an accounting, which is a technical word that simply means show your work. And I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear and felt more relief than anger, because the only language my mother respects is a calendar, and the only tone she hears is a deadline. So while my mother staged her party and performed her speech, I had already done something that looked small from the outside, but felt huge to me. I had gone through my bank app earlier that afternoon and canceled every autopay I had ever set up to keep her life from wobbling, the pharmacy deliveries that hit my card and then got repaid whenever she remembered, the utility drafts I agreed to cover during a rough patch that somehow became tradition, the online subscriptions she swore she needed, for work that actually funded my brother's side projects, and I did it without anger and without a message, because a boundary is not a fight, it is a quiet door you close, and then you walk away from the noise on the other side. And after I turned off the spigot, I opened my laptop at my kitchen table, and I wrote a letter that did not insult anyone and did not raise my voice and did not call anyone a liar. It simply cited the section of the probate code the attorney had given me and requested a full trust accounting within a specific number of days, which I wrote out in words because I wanted the line to read like a clock someone could hear even when they were pretending not to listen, and I printed it on plain paper. And I addressed it to my mother in her role as trustee, not as a mom, and to the backup trustee named in my father's documents, and to the family attorney, and I put each copy in an envelope with certified mail slips already filled out. And when I say I felt a kind of peace while I slid those pages into place, I do not mean a smug glow. I mean the relief you feel when you finally stop arguing with a person who only argues to win, and you start speaking to the only referee they cannot charm. The revenge you get from a speech lasts one night and fades with the dishes, but the revenge you get from a clock lasts as long as the clock keeps ticking. So when the party ended and people crowded the valet, and my mother basked in her victory lap, I did not hand her the big envelope because it was not time yet. I handed her a small white receipt from the post office the next morning with a tracking number written out in words and a copy of my letter stamped as accepted, and while she tried to laugh it off and tell me I was being dramatic and that lawyers cost money and that family business should stay private, I simply nodded and told her I could not wait to see her work, because the countdown had started and, for once, every tick belonged to me. I did not grow up thinking I would ever care about loan documents or closing disclosures or the difference between a certification of trust and a full trust instrument. Yet once I stopped arguing feelings and started following paper, the whole story stopped wobbling, because paper does not care who cooked the holiday roast or who tells better jokes at a party. Paper only cares about dates and signatures and whether the person who promised something had the right to promise it in the first place. So I spent evenings that other people use for television clicking through county records and lender portals and title company archives, and I learned that asking a quiet question in the right place will move more weight than a decade of shouting into a kitchen. And the quiet question I asked at the title office was whether they could provide the closing packet from the refinance my mother completed after my father died, because I was a named beneficiary of the trust that held the home, and the clerk did not roll her eyes or tell me to stop making trouble. She asked for my identification and the trust name, and then emailed me a secure link with a stack of documents that could have been a doorstop. And right there on the second page sat a certification saying the trustee had full power to pledge the property and to distribute proceeds at her discretion, signed by my mother and notarized by her best friend from church. And 5 pages later sat a gift letter to my brother describing a transfer from trust equity to support his business launch, and tucked near the end was an occupancy affidavit my mother signed stating she would remain the primary resident, while also authorizing a draw that posted the very week she moved in with her boyfriend. And I stared at those pages until the letters stopped swimming, and then I called the attorney and asked what a beneficiary is supposed to do when a trustee treats a locked family asset like a private wallet. The answer did not come with fireworks. It came with words that sounded boring in the best possible way. Things like duty of impartiality and duty to account and prohibition on self-dealing and surcharge, which is a dry term that means if you use trust money like it is yours and it is not, you can be made to put it back with interest. And I took notes and I asked for a template, and I wrote a second letter, even calmer than the first, that listed the draws and the dates I could see and asked for the bank statements that would show the rest. And while I waited, I did something that would have made me feel disloyal a year ago, but felt necessary now. I scrolled through my messages and pulled every thread where my mother had typed things like, "You know your brother will pay it back once the shop opens," or "Can we route the refund through my card because it is faster, or keep this between us because people judge what they do not understand." And I printed those threads and tucked them behind the Closing packet, and then I called the bank that serviced the line of credit, and I said the trustee was under an accounting request and that I needed to know the procedure for preserving records and restricting new draws until the accounting was complete. And the woman on the phone did not ask for family gossip. She asked for the trust tax identification number and the name of the trustee and my beneficiary status, and then she gave me the email for their fiduciary review desk and told me to send the letters and the certification and the death certificate and the beneficiary page from the trust, which I did before I had time to overthink what doing that would set in motion. When you have lived your whole life being told that family problems must stay indoors, the first time you route a problem to a hallway where there are clocks and file numbers, your stomach does a small flip, and mine did, but it was a productive flip. The kind you get when you finally put a heavy box on a moving belt, because 2 days later a man from the bank left a measured voicemail for my mother, and I did not have to guess what he said because she called me right after and snarled that I had embarrassed her and that the bank just told her the line was temporarily restricted pending documentation and internal review, and that I had no right to interfere with her finances. And I let her talk until she ran out of steam, and then I told her that I did not interfere with her finances. I simply asked the trustee of my father's trust to show the work. And the bank decided to press pause because banks do not like lending against question marks, and if she needed to be angry at someone, she could be angry at the law or at the paper or at the habit of signing things that look convenient in the moment. I am not delusional enough to pretend that a bank freeze heals a family, but it did something a decade of nice behavior never managed to do. It cut off the steady drip that kept my brother's projects alive long enough to become my mother's next reason to borrow. And when he called to inform me that I was petty and vindictive and jealous, I told him I was tired and busy and not available for coaching, and that his next draw would have to come from a lender who did not share a last name with any of us, and for the first time in years I heard his voice waver because he understood that a door he had always found open was now locked, and not because I kicked it shut in a tantrum, but because a lock is exactly what belongs on a door that guards something other people built and trusted you to keep safe. And while everyone scrambled to figure out how to spin a pause into a misunderstanding, I printed one more copy of the title packet and slid it behind the bigger document I had been refining with the attorney, because now, when I finally chose my moment, I would not be handing over an accusation. I would be handing over a record that would not clap for her even if the room did. By the time another week had passed and my phone had stopped ringing with relatives trying to play referee, I understood that the only way my mother could live with herself was by rewriting the script in her own head and then demanding the rest of us act it out as if it were truth, and that night at the party had not been a surprise curtain call. It had been a stage she built months in advance, carefully inviting the right people, arranging the music, and practicing her lines about loyalty and respect until she could deliver them without blinking, and the more I replayed it, the more I realized that she had not actually been talking to me at all. She had been talking to them, because humiliating me in private would not give her the same rush. She needed an audience to clap so she could point to their clapping as proof that she was right, and that was why I stayed calm, because nothing dries applause faster than silence. The relatives who called afterward told me I should be the bigger person, which is funny because for years being the bigger person meant paying bills, showing up to appointments, filling out forms, and biting my tongue when someone else was praised for effort I actually made. So when they said be the bigger person this time, I finally answered honestly and said I had already retired from that role. Because being the bigger person in this family was not a virtue, it was a sentence without parole. And I had served my term. They did not like hearing that because it robbed them of their favorite advice, the advice that lets them feel wise without actually doing anything. But I let the silence hang until they coughed and changed the subject, and that was the first silence I enjoyed in years. Meanwhile, my brother began sending me smug little messages about how mom was finally standing up for herself and how maybe now I would learn not to cross her, and I did not take the bait because if he wanted to measure his worth by the size of a line in a will, he was welcome to spend his life polishing a line someone else could erase in a minute, but I measured mine by whether I could look at a bank statement and know my name was not being used as a broom to clean up another person's mess. I wanted to reply with every piece of evidence I had, but I kept those messages in a folder because evidence is wasted on someone who has already decided not to care, and my brother had no interest in caring as long as his credit card kept working. And I had already made sure that spigot was shut. When I say I planned my move, I do not mean I sat in a dark room and schemed. I mean I carried on with my life, went to work, paid my bills, and at the same time let the countdown run on the accounting demand I had mailed. And I began adding little reminders to my calendar, not to create pressure on me, but to remind myself that pressure was now on her, because each reminder was a day closer to the date when silence would no longer be optional. And she would have to produce a paper trail she could not rewrite. Knowing that gave me a calm she could never touch, and when I saw her posts online about how blessed she was and how grateful she felt for loyal family, I let her have them, because those posts were like sugar, sweet for a moment and empty the next. While I was holding protein she would eventually have to chew. I admit there were moments when I doubted myself, when I wondered if maybe I was taking it too far, because no matter how much hurt sits on your chest, a child is wired to want a parent's approval. But every time the doubt started to rise, I pulled out one of the documents, looked at the signature that did not belong there, and remembered that this was not revenge pulled from thin air. This was accountability rooted in ink and law. That was enough to steady me again, because the satisfaction was not in yelling or exposing her too soon. It was in waiting for the right silence. The silence that falls when someone expects applause, but instead hears their own voice echo back at them with no one clapping. So when she called one afternoon to tell me that I had embarrassed her in front of the bank and that she hoped I was happy now that she had to scramble to find money for bills, I listened without comment. And then I asked calmly if she had begun assembling the accounting as required, and the pause on the other end was so long I thought the line had dropped, but it had not. It was just the pause of a person realizing the stage lights had burned out and the microphone no longer worked. That silence was better than any speech I could have given, and I hung up knowing that when the next party came, she might hold the glass, but I would hold the paper that would end the show. The day the clock ran out came with no apology and no packet on my doorstep, so I took the morning off work, met the attorney who never raised his voice and never promised fireworks. And we filed the petition that did not ask my mother to please be nicer but required her, as trustee, to account for every draw and every transfer and every signature she had placed on anything that touched the trust since the day my father died. And alongside that petition we asked for a temporary order that paused any new loans, barred any sale or refinance, suspended discretionary disbursements to my brother, and appointed a neutral to hold the keys while the numbers were tallied. And the clerk stamped the papers with a case number and a hearing date written out in words on a calendar that belonged to the court and not to my mother's mood. And in that moment I felt a relief so practical that it almost smelled like a clean ledger. Because we had turned a family story into a file with deadlines. And files with deadlines do not clap, they move. We walked from the courthouse to the recorder and placed a notice that told the world the property could not be sold or borrowed against without dragging that case number behind it, and then the attorney's paralegal sent the bank the order. And the bank responded with the cautious tone of an institution that prefers rules over charm, and within hours the line of credit that had been treated like an open tab became a frozen screen that said "See Fiduciary Desk," and I did not gloat because the point was never to watch anyone squirm. The point was to stop the drip and force the book to open where everyone could see the math, and after that I went home, fed the cat, answered emails, and waited for the only phone call that mattered, which came from an unfamiliar number and belonged to a process server who said service had been completed at my mother's home address without incident, which meant the legal part did not require a scene, yet I still wanted one quiet moment of my own choosing. Not for drama, but for closure. That moment came faster than I expected because my mother, either out of denial or out of reflex, had scheduled a small dinner to celebrate what she called a new chapter. And she wanted the same audience that had clapped for her at the party to hear about the updated will and the legacy she planned to build with people who understood loyalty. And I said I would come because I wanted no one to say I did not give her the floor. And I walked in with a single envelope that held a stamped copy of the petition and the temporary order and the notice we had recorded, and I sat through the salads and the quotes about family and endurance, and I listened to her talk about pruning, which is the kind of word people use when what they mean is cutting. And I watched her friends nod, and I waited until the plates were cleared and the room settled into that proud hush a host loves, and then I stood up without raising my voice and said I had brought something for her that I hoped would help her. Tell the whole story. I did not lecture because lecturing had never worked, and I did not accuse because accusations turn into theater. I simply slid the envelope across the table and said that the accounting request had become a court order with dates that were not flexible, and that a neutral, not I and not my brother, would be taking custody of the records and the keys until the numbers matched the promises, and I told her that past transfers to my brother would be treated as advances subject to equalization, unless justified by proper documents, and that any missing money could be surcharged, which was the polite word for put it back with interest, and I added, in a tone so even it surprised me, that her new will could say whatever it wanted because a will cannot move a dollar that sits in a locked trust, and the trust was now under the court's hand, and if she wanted to argue, she would need to argue with a calendar and a file, not with me. For a long beat she looked for a stage that was no longer there, and her friends stared at the envelope the way people stare at a little box that might hold something dangerous or something expensive. And my brother swore under his breath and checked his phone because he had already gotten an alert about a declined charge and did not yet understand why his plastic had gone from magic to ordinary. And I kept my hands loose at my sides and felt no need to comfort anyone because for once I had not created the problem. I had only named it where it could not be denied, and when my mother finally opened the envelope and saw the stamp and the calendar and the words that were not mine but the court's, her mouth moved around a protest that never formed. And she tried to say we could handle this privately if I would just be reasonable, and I told her I was being reasonable, which is why I stopped asking and started filing, because paper and time do not take sides, they only reveal them. I did not wait for the room to pick a team because there were no teams left to pick. There was only the law my father chose when he set up a structure that asked trustees to behave like adults, and I told her, gently and without a single raised syllable, that I would see her at the hearing unless she preferred to hand the accounting to the neutral early and spare herself the scramble. And then I thanked the server, pushed in my chair, and walked out without slamming anything, and the best part of that exit was not the quiet gasps or the silent phones lighting up with texts. It was the very simple knowledge that I had returned the story to the place where it belonged, which was not on a party stage or a family group chat, but inside a set of rules that do not bend when someone smiles. People have asked me since whether I went too far, and I always answer the same way. I say that I stopped cleaning up messes I did not make, and I asked a trustee to act like a trustee, and if that feels like war to someone, then maybe the problem was never my tone. And when the hearing came and the neutral took over and the first draft of the accounting showed more gifts than would fit under any blessing, I did not cheer, I only breathed, because that night in the restaurant I had not handed my mother a threat. I had handed her a clock and a lock and a mirror, and she will be living with all three long after the clapping ends.